Hi, I'm Charlene Collins Freeman. Thank you for joining me for this watercolor tutorial on painting this rooster on his morning strut. Let's start off by talking about the supplies I'll use for this project. I will paint on Arches cold press watercolor paper, 140 pounds, 11 by 15 inches. You should feel free to paint on whatever watercolor paper you prefer. Hot press and rough would both work beautifully. The watercolor brushes I'm using include a black gold 311 size 0, which is a round, and a majestic round 4250 size 10 zeros. This is really considered a miniature brush, and it's for the smallest details such as the eye. All my paints are professional grade Daniel Smith watercolor paints. I decided to use a very limited palette, which always ensures color harmony. I will use yellow ochre, quinacridone burnt scarlet, cadmium red medium, and indigo. This limited palette is almost a triad of primaries, although I do have two reds. I did my drawing with a 2H pencil, and you'll need an eraser. And because I'm using 140-pound paper, I decided to stretch it. To stretch it, I taped it to a gator board, which is just slightly bigger than my paper, and I taped it down with artist tape that is 2 inches wide. And of course, you'll need a water container, water, and paper towels. My reference photo is from Pixabay. Pixabay.com is a great resource for artists. Most photos on this website are copyright free and attribution free. Here is my line drawing. I've darkened it for the purpose of having it show up on the video here, but you should be sure you keep your pencil lines quite light if you prefer not to have them show up through the watercolor. I know many artists, however, that like to see the drawing through the watercolor, so that decision is really up to you. You'll notice also I left off the background. I was not interested in all the architectural background in the reference photo. I really want my painting to be all about the rooster, and I felt that that detailed background would just be distracting. I want to paint him quite loosely and expressively, and that includes the background. I'll make that up as I go along instead of trying to draw it in. Once I had my drawing done, I taped it down to my gator board and I wetted down my paper. I waited 24 hours for it to dry, and then I'm ready to begin. I start off by rolling up my kneaded eraser and rolling it gently across my drawing. This has the effect of lightening up the drawing quite a bit. I find that the kneaded eraser is much more gentle on watercolor paper than a regular eraser. By using the kneaded eraser, I don't run the risk of scuffing up my watercolor paper. I start off the project by loading my brush with just water and painting in the rooster. I'm careful where I put the water, especially on the edges, because once the water is down and I add paint, that paint will travel to all of the areas that are wet. I'm also careful when I paint the water around his head, as I want to be sure I keep those details clean and neat. Notice when I dip my brush into my water, I'm not dipping just the tip. I dunk the entire brush in there. I want to fully load it so that I have a lot of water on my brush to add to the paper. I have not watered down the tail portion of the rooster, but just the body. And in the center of my palette, I've taken a little bit of indigo and really watered it down. As I paint in these first few strokes, notice that I'm painting them in the direction that the feathers grow. That way, if my brush strokes end up showing up as the painting dries, they're working towards the texture and the shape of the rooster instead of painting against that. The video is playing at the speed at which I was actually painting, and I'm working rather quickly. I want to add in this first layer of paint while the water I laid down is still wet. This makes sure that I don't get any hard edges, that all of this paint softly travels across the wetted areas. And here I'm using watered down yellow ochre. For the most part, I'm sticking to the colors in the reference photo, but you definitely don't have to. You don't even have to stick to realistic rooster colors. You can get as fantastical as you want. I do recommend using the largest brush you're comfortable using for the size of the shape you're painting. These loose, expressive brush strokes are hard to get if you're using a really small brush. That initial damp paper is starting to dry, so I am working quickly. Now you can see me adding more indigo to my puddle of paint in my palette. And then I add just a touch of yellow ochre to it. I want to create some of the green for the reflections I see in the tail. I'm painting on dry paper. I did not originally wet the tail area. And I'm just painting those shapes that I see in the reference photo as having a greenish or bluish cast. I dip my brush back into the center of my palette where there is only indigo, and I add more paint to that to make it thicker and therefore darker. I start painting in some of the shapes of the rooster's tail feathers. Notice my small, short brush strokes around the edges as I try to capture the shape of those feather edges. To create that effect, I'm using just the tip of my brush. If your puddle of indigo is thinned out with too much water, the tail won't look this dark, or it'll really fade as it dries. If that happens, you'll want to come in and do a second pass at the tail. I want to nail it on the first pass, so I'm sure to use paint that is fairly thick. I would say it has the consistency of cream. I'm painting the indigo right up against the greenish and yellowy shapes that I painted earlier for the reflections in the tail, and I'm letting them butt up against each other. Because the indigo is thicker than the yellowy green areas, it's not exactly taking over those shapes. It's staying put where I'm painting, but it's still creating a soft, diffused edge between the reflections and the dark shadows in the feathers. I've mixed up yellow ochre and again a touch of indigo for the feet. I don't paint a lot of details into the feet. They don't interest me that much. Again, I add more indigo to my thick mix to make sure that it stays nice and thick and isn't getting watered down as I progress through the painting. And I continue to add some of those darker shapes I see. I try to recreate the suggestion of these shapes more than worrying about every little detail. You can see where the indigo is touching into the body of the bird that the edges are starting to diffuse because that first layer is still damp in there. Using just the tip of my brush, I'm adding the suggestion of some of the other dark spots I see throughout his body. I want to let the lighter white area underneath show through in this area as well, just like I see it in the reference photo. Be sure your brush isn't loaded with water. If you go in there with the brush loaded with water, you'll deposit a lot of water, which will have the effect of pushing the pigment you've already painted with to the edges, and you'll get blossoms. If you're concerned that your paintbrush has too much water in it, just tap it out on a dry towel before touching it into your bird. Here I've picked up thick yellow ochre and I'm adding it to the top side of the rooster's body. I don't paint that yellow ochre into my indigo. Mixing the yellow and the blue would start to give me green feathers, and I don't really want that on his body. You can see I pick up yellow ochre with my brush, and then instead of going straight from the yellow ochre in my palette to the bird, I put it into that little side well next to my yellow ochre. This gives me more control over how wet or how thick it is. Even with those yellowy feathers along the nape of the rooster, I am sure to leave some white stripes to show the white feathers showing through underneath. To create a brown for the wood post that he's walking on, I mix my two reds, the cadmium red medium and the quinacridone burnt scarlet. And then I touch a little bit of indigo in it and even a little bit of yellow. I'm basically mixing all the colors together to create this brown color underneath him. I don't want to paint it literally all the way across the sheet of paper, as I think that then it becomes too much of a focus. You could consider this either a fence post that he's walking on or a little patch of dirt. I only leave a hard edge on the top side where his feet are walking. And I leave the rest of this wood plank unfinished. I really want to paint this more loosely and expressively. I want to just make a suggestion of the ground or the wood plank that he's standing on, rather than being literal and painting a stripe from edge to edge at the bottom of the painting. I use the same brown to touch in just a few feathers at the top of the rooster. The trick really is to do less brush stroking than you think you have to do. Be confident with your brush strokes. Don't make short, little, hesitant brush strokes. Make a nice long brush stroke and then stop stroking into it. Keep in mind that the rooster's body is still wet, so anything I'm painting in will fade as it dries and also is still going down pretty softly as it dries. I'm not going to get a lot of hard edges as long as the layer I'm painting into is damp. For the rooster's comb and wattle, you could use cadmium red medium hue by itself, but I find it to be a little bit glaring. So I added quinacridone burnt scarlet to it to tone it down. You could also put a touch of indigo in it for the shadowy areas. For these details and for the rest of the head, I'm painting on dry paper. By painting on dry paper, I ensure that the paint stays where I put it. If I paint into a damp area, the paint will travel everywhere where there is dampness. These areas, I do want them to have hard edges. So think about whether you want to paint into a wet area or a dry area. It really depends on if you want hard edges or soft edges between colors. and between shapes. For as quickly as I was painting the rest of the body, I really slowed down for these details. I want to be sure I get the shape of the eye, the shape of the beak, the comb and the wattle down as accurately as possible. To paint the beak and eye, I put down my larger brush and pick up the miniature brush. With watery indigo, I paint the shape of the beak. Take your time with this detail. It's really easy for both the beak and the eye to get bigger and bigger as we paint it, especially if we're trying to correct a shape that we're not satisfied with. This is where having detailed drawing really helps. The rooster's eye has an orange cast to it, so I add yellow ochre to my cadmium red medium and paint in the outer shape of the eye. I felt like my mixture was still too red, so I go in directly and touch a little bit of yellow ochre into it while it's still wet. While I wait for that first layer of the beak and the eye to dry, I pick up fairly watery indigo with my miniature brush, and I paint in some of the dark stripes that I want to add to the feathers. Because this section of my painting is still slightly damp, you can see that each brush stroke I paint softens gently into the other feathers. If you would rather have hard edge feathers that stand out more, just wait until this section is completely dry before creating these feather strokes. If on the other hand you like this soft effect, but your rooster's body has completely dried, pick up your larger brush, fill it with water, and slightly paint over this area with that brush. As the water soaks into the rooster's body, you can create this same effect with your indigo. Just remember to switch back to your miniature brush for these strokes. The bright red paint that I've already put down has now had a chance to soak into the paper. It's not puddled on top of my paper, and that's a great time to add any dark shadows I want with my indigo. I can just touch it into those areas and it'll diffuse gently without flooding those areas. And again, with my miniature brush, I now come back in to add the darkest details in the beak. I darken up my red mixture and start adding the darker red details around the eye. Really take your time with these details, even though they're small. Whenever we paint people or animals, the smallest details in the face carry the rest of the painting. That is definitely where the viewer's eye goes. I pay careful attention to the reference photo for all the details in the face. Again, I'm painting the details of the face and the wattle on dry paper. And I'm using my smallest brush for maximum control. As I paint the shapes around the eye between the comb and the wattle, it gets too much red in there. The red from the comb and the wattle are flooding that area. I'll come back in and lift some of that red out. I want it to soak into the paper a little bit more. So in the meantime, I pick up my burnt scarlet with cadmium red medium in it, and I add some of the details along the edge. This is a darker mix than what I've used in the rest of the head. I outlined the eye since it does have a dark circle around it. And I paint in the far side of the wattle. Time to let the face dry before I decide what else it might need. I pick up my larger brush again, and you can see how much the tail has faded already. I pick up thick indigo, and I start painting in an even more expressive tail on this fellow. As I darken the feathers, I want to be sure I leave some of the lighter ones that show the reflected light. I don't want to cover the entire tail with this dark indigo. I even go back in, and while that indigo is damp, I add some yellow ochre to it. The indigo is fairly thick at this point, maybe even thicker than cream, a yogurty consistency. And now it's time to think about that background. I will use the same colors in my background that are in the rooster. I'm not a fan of creating backgrounds with colors that are not in the subject. It just runs the risk of looking like they're disassociated from each other. With the background, I want to also create some hard edges and some soft edges, or lost and found edges. For example, by painting in very watery indigo up against the front of the rooster's chest with that yellowy color, I've created a hard edge. Hard edges draw our attention. So I'm going for more hard edges around the front and the head of the bird. And then towards the back, I want to create some lost edges where parts of the rooster are melting into the background. The paper of my background is completely dry, but if you feel more comfortable doing your background by wetting the paper first, feel free. Notice that as I paint the background, I'm using very watery versions of the colors in the rooster, and I'm painting right over the brown wood fence that he's standing on to tie it in even more to the background. As you can see, I'm painting really quickly. I want to be sure that I'm not letting any hard edges dry on my paper. I want the background to look soft and diffused all the way across the painting. That requires moving pretty quickly with my brush. It helps that I'm painting with very watered down puddles of paint, as they take longer to dry on the paper. I'm also painting right up to my rooster. I find that a lot of times students will stop just short of their subject as they're painting the background, which ends up creating a small white edge of paper all around their subject. It can have a very unappealing halo look. So paint right up to the subject. If it bleeds a little bit into the background, that'll still work well. And that is what starts creating lost edges. Our subjects always look more interesting if some of the edges get lost into the background. If a subject is hard edge up against the background all the way around, it starts to look like it was perhaps cut out and stuck on a different background. Here you can see I'm really playing up, bleeding the tail into the background. So I'm using watery indigo, and I'm brushing pretty vigorously up against the tail to reactivate some of that paint. The tail becomes my lost edge as the rooster's blending into the background. Lost edges can be pretty magical in our artwork, and many artists look for ways to blend the subject into the background. Don't consider it a mistake if you touch up against your subject and it bleeds slightly into the background or into an adjacent subject. My colors are slightly darker on the left hand and the bottom side of the painting. Again, I paint right over the wood that he's standing on. And I paint over one of the legs as well. That has the effect of pushing it farther back. Notice also that my brush strokes are not just straight across or vertical or diagonal. My brush is really going in several directions as I create this background. I don't want it to come across as if I painted a picket fence in straight lines. So I keep that brush moving in all different directions as I paint in the watery background. That felt a little bit like a house on fire. I had to move so quickly. So now that it's done, I'm relieved to pick up my miniature brush and look at the final details in the rooster's head. With the miniature brush, I pick up fairly thick indigo and very carefully paint in the darkest parts of the beak and the eye. You can see just how slowly and carefully I'm painting these two parts of his head. For the darkest details around the eye that are red, I mix my two reds together, the quinacridone burnt scarlet and cadmium red medium, with just a touch of indigo. For other areas in the comb, I add a few spots of pure cadmium red medium hue. It's a very bright color and it's opaque, so it can sit on top of darker colors, unlike most watercolors. I continue building up either the bright red with cadmium medium red or adding a touch of shadow to the reds with my mixture of cad red medium, quinacridone burnt scarlet, and a bit of indigo. I finesse in the last few details for the comb and wattle. The last thing I want to do is switch out to my bigger brush and lift out some of the red that has built up around his eye. I lift out with a clean brush that is pretty thirsty. And with that, I'm done with this lovely rooster out on his morning strut. Here's my finished piece. I hope you've enjoyed this demonstration. Thanks for joining me.